Begin by painting all the gold areas with Rhinox hide, a very thin wash just to give a good foreground for the colours we place on top. Then use Victorian brass, and while the paint is still wet, we use pale burnt metal to highlight it. This is a wet blend using the techniques that we've picked up in the PDF describing how we create non-metallic metals. Essentially what I'm trying to create here is a good base tone, a good warm base tone with a Victorian brass, and then I'm adding specular highlights with the pale burnt metal. I will go on to develop this further with silver, and I will deepen it down with overlapping washes of purple and Rhinox hide. But essentially what we need to do here is work very fast, very loose, and just establish the mid-tones. Don't worry if your work looks very bitty at the end. Don't worry if it doesn't look smooth initially. We don't want smoothness at this point. That's what glazes are for. Later on in the painting process we can glaze these very disparate tones together. What we do want to avoid is middling mid-tones. So if you find your golds don't quite pop or your metallics don't quite pop, I think building up layer upon layer, it does tend to kill contrast. If we go in straight away with a very strong contrast between the lights and shadows, the specular highlights and the shadows, we will end up with a much finer end result. And we can go on and refine any details further on in the painting process. I'm using a 0 brush from the Winsor Newton range. So you can see it's a lot finer than the brush I was previously using. It's a lot smaller. We are able to control the scene a lot better. We're able to get much finer detail using this brush. If you're using a new Winsor Newton brush, then I wouldn't worry too much about that, because they do come to very fine tips. In this case I decided to downgrade to a 0 instead of my usual 1, purely because the 1 is getting a bit knackered now. I do need to replace it. So by moving down, by using a finer tip, a finer brush, we're able to really hit those highlights. If you do have difficulty seeing or imagining where the highlights would exist on the miniature, you can always put a single layer of Victorian brass down, and the metallic pigment in there will inform the rest of the paint job. Snap a photograph on your phone underneath a direct strong light source, and that should give you an idea of where shadows and lights would naturally be created on a metallic surface. Use that image, use that picture as the framework for the rest of your paint job, and you can build it around that. The paint consistency is roughly 2 parts paint to 1 part water. We do need it slightly thicker than we normally use, especially thicker than a glaze, which I normally encourage my students to use. I'm always encouraging students to thin their paint. In this case, not so much. We do need this paint slightly thicker applied to the surface so it doesn't dry instantly. When we add silvers to highlight, we can begin the blending process on the miniature itself, which would not be able to achieved if the paint instantly dried. If we were using very, very thin layers, we would not be able to do that wet blend on the miniature itself. Now, I do realize, again, this is a very, very you need a certain level of brush technicality in order to pull off these techniques. I would highly suggest buying a Custodes army and try it on that. Anything gold, hell, you can even do it on a piece of sprue, just to give you 1 or 2 attempts before you tackle a miniature like Krole, before you go on to that big project that you have in mind. Remember, practicing these things, more often than not, the first time you try it, it won't look so hot. The second time gets slightly better. The third time, that's when you start to get a handle of the technique. Bear in mind, I do make mistakes in these videos. I edit them out. I redo them. I mean, so I will be doing a Blood Angel tutorial later on that you guys will love, and it's in there, warts and all. I had some very, very highly frustrating moments with that miniature, so that will be placed in it. So one of the reasons why I think this the videos especially, this is a culmination of years of technique, years of hard work being put into practice at this point. I paint nearly every day, every single day, so my muscle memory is there, my technique is improving every single day, every single time I have a brush. Don't be hard on yourselves if you're unable to take off these techniques straight away. Some of you will need a bit more practice. Enjoy the process, enjoy that frustrating process of growing and learning. But practice really does make perfect. I'll leave the video running at normal speed. I do want you to see this done in real time. So as you can see here, I've mixed a small amount of Elendil purple into the brush, and I'm just adding some shadows along the ridge. The thing is, with using gold or painting gold, it doesn't reflect the surroundings nowhere near as well as silver. A silver surface is essentially a warped mirror. Depending on the shine and the sheen and how well maintained the armour is, it will really reflect the surfaces around us. You could even try a similar technique yourself by taking a spoon and looking at it, just looking at a spoon. You look crazy, your partner will be questioning your sanity, but you can see it reflects the surfaces around you. You can see yourself in the spoon. If you put a piece of fruit next to it, you'll see that piece of fruit. But with gold or brass, if you perform the same technique, if you perform the same experiment, place a piece of fruit next to it, we will not get an exact reflection from it. Instead, it will change the hue slightly more than it will have that drastic change with silver. We do need to bear this in mind when it does come to painting gold. We don't want shocking transitions. We don't want a reflection of the surfaces around us. What we do need is to work in thin glazes to corrupt the underlying hue. I'm working from a base tone of Victoria Brass and Pale Burnt Metal as the highlight, and in between those two colours is a good mid-range of colours for gold. And then we could go on to enhance that with Rhinox hide washes and purple, especially in the shadows. I don't know why purple works so well with gold, it just does. Let's have a look at the Sword of Oblivion next. Again, I will leave this in real time so you can see the brush strokes as much as possible and how it's done in real time. I mean, even if you observe that video very closely, you can see where the specular highlight and shadow runs down the vein of the miniature. So while the Victorian brass is on the miniature, I have added Rhinox hide to shade it, and I'm just running that along the length of the hilt, and I've done the same with pale burnt metal, and instantly it creates a highlight and shadow. It's just that simple after 15 years of relentless painting. But you'll get there. You'll get there faster with these videos, I assure you. So I'll be performing the same trick here, wet blending the gold with Rhinox hide and some silver. Afterward we can use Elendil Violet. We could corrupt it with Elendil Violet and further washes of Rhinox hide to help blend it together. Once it dries, it will look quite... the blend doesn't look as seamless as it does here because the pigment is still shifting, it's still changing. It won't look as refined as it does at the moment, as it is when it is drying. So we need to wait for it to dry before we add our final shadows and highlights. Okay, next up let's have a look at the Iron Halo. Now unfortunately, because this isn't a recessed area, we won't get the same kind of light reflections we will off the rest of the miniature, and because it's a slightly more complex surface to be working with, we need to break it down into simpler shapes and make sure that we aren't overwhelmed by it. So we start off exactly the same way. First we put on a layer of Victorian brass, and then I use Rhinox hide to begin the shading process. This is a very rough, loose sketch stage just to get used to where the highlights are. Now I know some people like painting in sub-assemblies, and one of the reasons why I discourage you from doing it, especially the last few layers, the very last highlights and shadows, is for this very reason. It's hard to know exactly where our lights and shadows would naturally fall when everything is assembled. The temptation would be to airbrush all the gold things separately, and then when we place it together, we have a better surface to work with. We've cut out a lot of hassle. But unfortunately, you do get some odd reflections by doing that. Because everything's assembled in front of us, I know exactly where the shadows and highlights should exist, and we can keep everything consistent across the entire miniature. If you do sub-assemblies, I do it myself, by all means do it. It's a good technique to get a hold of, but only place your final highlights at the very last. Otherwise, we will end up with some very unusual looking miniatures. I was fortunate enough to speak with the sculptor of this miniature, Simon Egan, the lead sculptor at Forge World. Although this isn't directly related to the painting of the miniature, it is something I do like bringing up whenever Jenetia Krole is discussed. So this miniature is part of a dying breed, all hand sculpted completely from start to finish by the creator. More and more, especially in larger companies, CAD design is seeing a renaissance. It's very easy to produce sculpts, or rather I should say it isn't easy to produce, but it's more time efficient to produce sculpts en masse. Now this miniature, unfortunately in the years to come, I think will be seen as a bit of a throwback. This is a singular creation of an artist using clay, using traditional techniques. The way it's sculpted, the character that was able to be produced from it is unlike, in my opinion, what CAD design is currently able to produce. For the most part, there are some excellent CAD designs out there, but this miniature, when you get a miniature this fine, you do have to take the time to just appreciate it. Take your time with it, don't rush through it, just spend a few moments, put on some good music, have some good snacks next to you, and really enjoy this process, because this really is part of a dying breed. I seem to have slipped into painting the back litanies on here, so you know what, why not, let's pop it in here as well. It all goes to inform the brush technique. So as you can see, I've put down some Rhinox hide, and I've used some, let me look this up, birch. It's birch by scale 75. So as you can see, I've just placed the birch down. I've placed the birch down on one end and Rhinox hide on the other, and while it's still wet, I've mixed them together very, very quickly on the surface. So that colour there is a combination of the both of them. It kind of makes a walnut colour. There is a colour called walnut in scale 75's range, which would be appropriate for this. But as you can see, I'm moving the brush back and forth to give the impression of worn, teared paper. And while it's still wet, I can manipulate the paint back and forth to create a seamless blend. Very quick, very messy. It won't dry as seamless as it appears. We will need further glazes and layers on top just to help refine it, but it's an excellent technique for getting quick blends done very, very, very nicely. I mean, we've done this technique across the entire miniature. This has just been an exercise in wet blending. I think part of the reason why I wanted to tackle this project with a brush is because it is a more traditionally sculpted miniature. I thought I wanted to pay homage to that with the brush instead of using the airbrush, which isn't cheating. If you do use the airbrush, more power to you. Just for this project, I felt the brush carried a bit more significance to it. I wanted to show off a bit of my brushwork technique to you guys, especially the more advanced stuff, so you can get a handle of it. So I would be interested to chart exactly what projects you choose to do with an airbrush and which ones you purely choose to do with a brush. There is something really nice about just tackling a miniature from start to finish with a brush. I don't want to say antiquated because I don't want to sound like a dick, but there is something quite nice, a bit of a throwback to when you didn't have much in the way of weathering pigments or fancy techniques. It was just you, the brush, and some paint, and a wet palette. Might be rejiggering history a little bit there, misremembering things. As a 9-year-old using a wet palette, maybe not. But here you go, so the miniature's dried slightly, and I'm using pure birch in a feathering technique. So this is where the paint is slightly dry. I'm not aiming for a perfect blend. I want texture to be seen there. I'm adding this on the very outer portions of the script work, ready for when I do add some litany, well, faux litany to it. Back and forth, further developing it. Yet the paint consistency is roughly, let's say 40% paint, 60% water, maybe slightly more water. Again, if you feel you need to use thinning agents, please go ahead and do so. I'm blessed to live in a very rainy country, so I don't need to worry about paints drying out too quickly. If anything, I probably need a moisture trap to get rid of all the excess moisture in the air. There's a reason why Games Workshop was developed in Britain. So there you go. This is a lot more. This is almost a dry brush technique at this point. This is about 80% paint to 20% water, if that. It is the majority paint. As you can see, the bristles on the end of the brush are very flayed out at this point, and it is texture to the max. I do not want smooth blends. When you look at parchment paper, especially old papyrus, it does come with almost like lemules, like they're age worn, they're broken, they're smashed to pieces in some unfortunate instances. So with Jenetia being on Prospero, I imagine this isn't a very safe environment to be in. These litany tapers would have already accrued a bit of damage, a bit of texture, a bit of interest. That is it for this tutorial. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.